go, and as far as public lands go, and just the battle between the state of Utah, who wants all that land and wants to get it out of federal hands. But we'll get into all that. I want to point out, like, I want to go back that picture with the beautiful canyon and the sage grouse there. I just put that into Chat GPT. I said, give me a photo of Utah canyon lands and a sage grouse, and that's what it did. It's pretty impressive, I think. But all right, so let's get going here. So the presentation is called Wings Over Red Rock, Saving Utah's Imperiled Birds. So my name is Chris Riccardo. If you could try to hold your questions until the end, or if you want to throw them in the chat, we could probably get to them possibly in real time. I'm not going to be watching the chat too much, but I think Lisa's going to kind of field that stuff for me. So if there's something you really need to know, put that out there, or we'll have a Q&A at the end. So, and as Lisa said, I'm the Midwest Field Organizer for SUWA, which is the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance. A lot of things in this job are very long and a mouthful, so there's a lot of acronyms happening. I'm based out of Chicago, so I'm coming live to you from Chicago now. I'm sure a lot of you are probably not in Michigan because of the weather, which I understand. I started doing wilderness volunteers projects, which are service projects in Utah about 20 years ago. So I started doing that as a volunteer, and that just kind of led me to SUWA, like just going to Utah and working there for a couple weeks a year, and then finding out all the goofy things that are happening there. It kind of made me feel a little more passionate about what I was doing. I came from environmental work, but not in the type that I'm doing now. I was kind of doing flood and fire restoration for insurance companies. So if you had a pipe break in your house or your stove caught on fire, we'd come in and clean it up. But now I'm doing like ecological restoration, which is what I was volunteering and doing for 20 years before transitioning. So volunteering, and then wound up getting actually paid for doing the things I love to do. So you know what they say, if you love what you do, you're not really working. So it's pretty cool to be in this position now. Acronym alert. So you're going to hear me say a lot of things like BLM, NPS, TMPs, FLIPMA, all these things. I'm going to try to kind of say them before I start using the acronym. But if for any reason I give you an acronym and you have no idea what it means, feel free you can jump out and ask. You don't have to stay muted for that, or throw it in the chat. But yeah, if there's something I'm talking about that you're not really up to speed on, feel free to just let me know. Let's see. So ornithological expert. Not really, not really. I've gotten my feet wet. So I've worked with, I've been doing these wilderness volunteers projects and kind of going around the country, and it just happens that everywhere I go, there's like cool birds. So from like an osmosis kind of process, I've gotten to learn some stuff about birds. I'm sure I'm nowhere near as prolific with birds as you all are, but I know some stuff. On the slide, it says New Mexico, Hawaii, Arizona, Utah, Illinois, and throughout the Midwest. I've just, like I said, kind of been immersed in this situation where people that I hang out with are really into birds, so I learned things. I worked at the John G. Shedd Aquarium in Chicago, and this is in between the transition from going from home restoration to ecological restoration. My first manager was the president of the Chicago Ornithological Society, and he still is. So he was great to be working next to a few days a week. So So I know a little bit, I know more than the average person, but probably not as much as you. So I'm just going to put that out there. And basically, as far as this presentation goes, it's going to be more about like um, education towards like public land issues in Utah, but I'm going to put the birds that live there into the presentation. So don't worry. All right. So as far as SUWA, the Southern Utah Wilderness Alliance, once again, one of those acronyms, we're a 50c3. If that doesn't matter, I should probably take that out of there. We're based out of Salt Lake City. We also have an office in Moab, Utah. We have an office in Washington, D.C., because we like to be where the policies are being made. We have regional organizers like myself, so I'm the Midwest organizer. There's an East Coast organizer, a West Coast organizer, and there's Southwest. And there's two in Utah. So Utah is like probably most of the work. There's probably 15,000 members, and I would say over half of them are in Utah, and the rest are across the country. Um, we were started in 1983 by some concerned activists that were kind of upset about a bad wilderness inventory that the Bureau of Land Management had to conduct. We are part of the steering committee for the Utah Wilderness Commission Coalition and the National Wilderness Coalition. National Wilderness Coalition is new. As far as the steering committee, it's Sierra Club, SUWA, and a National Resource Defense Council. So we're kind of the umbrella over 100 different organizations and businesses that are in support of what we're trying to do. So let's see. So someone asked if I was Clayton Doffenbaugh's replacement. Not replacement, but he came before me. So I'm Clayton 2.0, as we like to say. I'm not new. Well, I'm new, but I'm not improved, because Clayton was kind of a superstar. He's a rock star. He's still around with Sierra Club, and he's working probably just as hard as he was in his retirement as he was with SUWA, with the Sierra Club in the wilderness division. So yeah, so people say like, why does what does Michigan have to do? What does the Midwest have to do with Utah? I think that there's a lot of similarities. And through my travels around the Midwest, I'm seeing a lot of similarities, and a lot of the Midwestern issues are very similar. I put this slide up here. It's like, buffalo roaming the open prairies. There's woodlands, waterfalls, rivers, things like that. Well, I mean, literally, Utah's pretty much got the same thing. There's just maybe a little less vegetation in some of the areas, but basically the same ecological aspects. But of course, we come to the industrial aged, and in Michigan, a lot of logging and mining and urban sprawl. So loss of, as far as birds are concerned, it's loss of critical nesting and feeding habitats, and disruption of migratory patterns. So there's, these things that naturally birds like that have been taken away from them, and that's basically because of human impacts. So same thing happens in Utah. A lot of the same things: mining, the logging, the extraction, things like that. I love this quote. As of 2023, 2.5% of the lower 48 states is designated as wilderness, which is only about the size of Minnesota. So that whole area of the lower US just has a little spot of wilderness left in it. And we'll talk about why wilderness is important. I'm sure you all know, but we'll get into that. I love this quote too. This is from basically our 30 by 30 pamphlet, which we won't talk a whole lot about 30 by 30, because I'm not sure if it's going to be around when the new administration starts. But so a football field's worth of natural lands disappears to development in the United States every 30 seconds. pretty impactful statement. So I like to point that one out. But there's obviously other good ones here, like like 1/3 of American wildlife is more than 12,000 species are at increased risk of extinction. So, we're all in this sixth extinction crisis. I'm sure you all don't need to be talked to about that. But so between why does Michigan matter to Utah? I just don't think borders matter. I really don't. And I'm sure you all are aware. But I think we're all connected. Climate change is a real thing. We're seeing these fires out in California. And as far as connection goes, we had, was it last year, the year before, we had those fires in Canada, and we couldn't go outside in Chicago, and I think that was a thing for people out in the Midwest, is like everything coming from Canada was affecting us. So Utah and Michigan, not that much different in the distance away. So not just because of that, but just what happens on a grand scale. But clean water, clean air, healthy biodiversity and ecosystems. These are things why we need to protect some of these wilderness areas. And I like to say what happens in Utah can happen where you live, especially, I hate to say it, but legislation. If there's bad legislation in Michigan or Utah, it could make its way to anywhere in the United States. So we're trying to keep the bad legislation in Utah to a minimum at best, so it doesn't make its way across the country and just set precedents for other states. Because that's basically what would happen. If something bad happened in Utah, it would just set that precedent. It would kind of open up a can of worms, and we'd be in a lot of trouble. The last bullet point on here is that the areas we're trying to protect are the largest and last remaining wilderness in the lower U.S. So pretty important that we try to save these places. So, all right, okay. What about the birds? All right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to keep talking about Utah and the public lands and these areas that we're trying to protect. But there's so much crossover with the birds. So like I said, I'm not the bird expert, but I know there's some pretty cool birds out in Utah, and there's some pretty cool areas in Utah that cross over with important bird areas that Audubon has designated. So let's start off with the yellow-billed cuckoo. So the yellow-billed cuckoo, that's one of these endangered birds. I kind of put on the slide, I tried to make it a little bit interactive in the fact that where these birds are found are some of the areas that we're actually trying to protect. So the Dirty Devil River areas where this yellow-billed cuckoo is sometimes found. It's pretty rare, so it's not found a whole lot. But so it's habitats, usually riparian woodlands. Riparian are, if you're not familiar, it's areas around rivers and streams and things like that. So the key locations, basically what I'm putting down as key locations is areas we're trying to preserve. So it's not necessarily just their most important locations, just locations that have to do with these areas that we're trying to protect. And and I'll list a conservation status, because I think that's the most, like, that's kind of the one that hits hard. But fewer than 2,000 breeding pairs, that's kind of that's kind of low. And most of that reason is because of habitat loss, which we'll find is the common theme here. But so I'm sure you've all heard of the yellow-billed cuckoo. If not, feel free to throw some questions in the chat, and we'll just keep on moving along. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you a couple bird examples as we go through what's happening in Utah here. So I just want to give you a little refresher on public lands, because public lands are different out east of the Mississippi than west of the Mississippi. West of the Mississippi, as far as the far west, there's a lot of rural lands where we don't have that so much in the east. But so this land is your land, federal land, public lands. It's your land, but it's owned by the United States. So that's what makes it public land. It's managed and administered by the federal government. So these are, you know, your national wildlife refuges, your national forests, your national parks, national monuments, things like that. Things like these lands are pretty important for clean air and clean water. Utah in particular was kind of acquired by the United States from Mexico, but there was kind of some people here before, or some people in Utah before it was acquired by the United States who were trying to escape the United States and trying to get out of federal control and do their own thing. So there were pioneers that went out there and settled in Utah before it was a state. And those are the kind of the people who are like, we still want this land for ourselves. And those are the old attitudes that we're trying to work around. But a lot of these lands were kind of left over, if you will, and remote lands because they were so rugged and just remote that they were hard to settle. They were hard to get to. So they were kind of nobody wanted them. So that's why they became federal lands. So Another point on that is Utah politicians often try to introduce legislation that would create bad precedent for public lands, which I had mentioned before. So we try to keep those bad precedents from spreading around, and we don't want those to happen at all. So public lands in Michigan, I'm just going to kind of blaze through these a little bit, but 4.6 million acres in Michigan, so 12.6% of Michigan is public land. In contrast to Utah, 65% of the state's total land area, or 35 million acres, is public land. I'm just letting people in on the meeting here. If I can find my mouse. Oh, okay, we already got it. So, all right, so Michigan 12%, Utah 65%. So like 2/3 of Utah is public land. Just because it's so rugged and remote and it was acquired later on, nobody wanted it. Nobody knew what to do with it. In the whole United States, 28% of the total land area is public land. And you'll see in that slide, it's mostly on the West Coast, you know. Not a whole lot in the East, not a whole lot in the Midwest. And public lands being in the terminology of not necessarily Army Corps of Engineer, who they kind of dictate all waterways. So there's waterways everywhere, and those are all under the Army Corps, but we're not really talking about that too much. So yeah, so big difference in East versus West with public lands. So that's why we don't hear a whole lot about it. People out here in the East don't know what the BLM is, or the Bureau of Land Management. They think it means something else after recent events. But yeah. So let's see. I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. All right. So all right, now we're at the Mexican spotted owl. They're so cute. They're just too cute. So yeah, they're one of those Utah birds that we'll find in Zion and Grand Staircase, Capitol Reef, and Grand Staircase, Cedar Breaks. Cedar Breaks is north of Escalante before Zion. It's like a mini Bryce, if you will. I'm sure some of you have probably been there. So yeah, let's see. They're threatened under the Endangered Species Act since 1993. Population decline primarily due to habitat loss, which, like I said, we're going to see a lot of that theme. So they're also a high priority for conservation. Yeah, they're kind of cool birds. I'm sure you probably know a lot about them, more than me, but yeah. nocturnal predators, super quiet. They love to live in the canyons in Utah, although they do live in some of the forests, but I think they prefer the canyon country more than the forest in Utah. Monogamous partners. So, and I'm sure most birds are, except, let's see. The great blue heron, I believe, does not necessarily stay monogamous. That was one of my things I learned on the Chicago River and doing the tours with the Shed Aquarium. So let's see. Let's see. All right, let's talk about the difference between national parks and national monuments. Let me see here, see what I did. Ba, ba, ba. All right, so let's start with national parks because they're big. Everybody knows national parks. National parks I'm just going to give you a little, refresher on public lands and designations. So, national parks are kind of, the big ones that everybody knows about. They're proclaimed by Congress. So, it takes an act of Congress to get a park designated. The National Park Service Organic Act of 1916 is what kind of is what we're basing the national parks on now. Before 1916, there were national parks, but they weren't the same as they were. They had this idea of national parks, but they weren't exactly thorough with what they wanted to do with them. We're like, we need to preserve these places. But then, yes, Yosemite, the Yosemite Valley, they actually took a section of Yosemite Valley and dammed it. And this was in a national park at the time. But the Hetch Hetchy Valley, they dammed it for water for, LA and stuff like that. So then they figured, hey, we better not do this again. We need to change things. A lot of activists were out there, Ansel Adams and things like that, and they're like, we need to protect these areas a little better than what we've got going. So the Organic Act of 1916 came to pass. Let's see. I love to do the trivia game of what was the first national park, but it's hard to do this on Zoom. But if you know the first national park, I don't know, put it in the chat, and the first person who puts it in the chat um, gets a recognition by me. I don't have anything to give you. So, um, the thing with national parks is they have conflicting purposes. So there's preservation that you're trying to keep someplace pristine and keep it for the future, but you're also opening up to people. So I put a few photos on the slide of the traffic jam at Arches and the line at Zion, and so there's definitely a balance that is trying to be maintained with national parks, conservation versus access, meaning you want to save these places, but you want people to be able to visit them and experience them, which is super important, and we need that. But you've got things that commercial use that has to happen there for this, like putting in a coffee stand, an ice cream shop, a hotel, a gift shop, things like that. So you want to preserve something, you've got people in there. It's a delicate balancing act. There's even parks where there's pressure for extraction. So keeping those things out are a little difficult, but with help from folks like you and organizations like SUWA and Grand Canyon Trust and Grand Canyon Institute, we're doing okay. We're doing all right. National monuments, on the other hand, these are proclaimed by presidents under the Antiquities Act. So basically, the president can go in and say, we need to save this land. I can't wait for Congress. I'm going to sign it into designation under a monument via the Antiquities Act. And this came to be a lot with indigenous peoples' natural resources. They would find places like Mesa Verde or Canyon de Chelly or Chaco culture. National Historical Monument, places like this, they'd be come across early in the day, and they would basically kind of get emptied out. People would go there and take the artifacts out and do whatever they wanted with them before we actually had a chance to understand what was happening in these areas. So taking all these things out of context wasn't helping. So at the same time, trying to get things established as a monument was just taking too long under Congress. So, um, yeah, so they came up with the Antiquities Act, where a president could just designate it without waiting for Congress, which causes a lot of contention in places out west. Uh, Grand Staircase,
Mhm.
for example. The locals did not. Well, I feel like most places that are designated, the locals didn't want it. I think even like Sleeping Bear Dunes, that was a place where initially people didn't want that to happen, and it did, and it's kind of a cool place now. I think people appreciate it more. Anyway, so these places with the Antiquities Act that are usually turned into a national monument or a seamount or things like that. They're usually administered or managed by the National Park Service, NPS, or the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, or the Forest Service. So this is kind of all those government places with a national usually in front of them. You know, national wilderness, national refuge, things like that. Also within national monuments and national parks, there can be wilderness inside of these designated parcels. So if a national park could have wilderness in it, national monuments could have wilderness in them. So could national forests. It's just there's definite characteristics for wilderness, and if they're lucky enough to get designated, that's awesome. And we'll get to that too. So with national monuments, they're used for multi-use. That's been the Bureau of Land Management's thing since they started. They were like the National Grazing Act when it first started, and they realized there's more to these lands. So their first iteration was kind of extraction and logging and grazing, and that was kind of their focus. And even their old logos had like bulldozers and cows on them and things like that. But once again, like back in 1916, when they did the National Park Service Organic Act, people were concerned. They said, hey, these are our public lands. This is nature. We're using the resources with no recourse, or, nobody's really looking out to see what's happening here. So if places are getting clear cut and logged, and they're just losing these areas. Um, so, so I'm getting way ahead of myself, but let's see where we go here. So, oh, I'm gonna go back. Yeah. So what was happening is people were logging too much, people were extracting too much. The grazing was going kind of unchecked, if you will. People weren't really watching out. We had these large tracts of land out there, and not enough people to kind of keep an eye on it. So things were going a little, a little off kilter as far as how much things people were taking. And I'll hold it there and move on to the next bird, the southwestern willow flycatcher. Now this one seems like it's pretty rare. So let's see. Once again, riparian riverbanks. We'll find it in Grand Staircase, Bears Ears National Monument. That doesn't mean New Mexico. It's National Monument. Around the Dirty Double River and Labyrinth Canyon. Been endangered since 1959. This is the hard hitter here. Less than 1,000 breeding pairs left across their range, including in Utah. So yeah, some of the main reasons is habitat loss. So once again, you take the places they like away, and you're gonna lose the animal. So as we all know. All right, and then back into public lands. Sorry if you were hoping for more bird stuff, but we'll get there, and we'll have questions and answers. So in 1964, the Wilderness Act was was designated, and it just hit its 60th anniversary last year. But it's a little over 60 years old. It's still 60. It's not quite 61 yet. But it created the National Wilderness Preservation System. So that's like all of your national forests, your national parks, your national wildlife refuges. And it gave Congress the power to designate federal land as wilderness. And it's a super cool bill. Like, for a bill and a piece of legislation that are usually boring and dry, it's kind of a cool read. So if you ever get the chance to read it, check it out. It's got some beautiful wording in it. So there were some problems with it, as with everything. Nothing's perfect, especially back in '64, but it was it was a great push. And once again, all these people were concerned about what was going on. And, we're losing our wilderness. We have to stop the rampant loss of our natural areas, just like back in the early 1900s when the National Park Service revamped their guidelines. It failed to recognize indigenous peoples, and they didn't really include indigenous peoples as much as now. Just now, I feel like 60 years later, things are starting to change, even with the marine sanctuary. I think someone was talking about at the beginning of the presentation. People are now referring to the indigenous peoples that have known what is supposed to be done for time memoriam, to now. And it's good that we're finally starting to tune in and getting those people involved. So yes, it's a great quote from President Johnson when he signed the Wilderness Act in 1964. If future generations are to remember us with gratitude rather than contempt, we must leave them something more than the miracles of technology. We must leave them a glimpse of the world as it was in the beginning, not just after we got through with it. And I think from 1964 to 2025, that sentiment still holds very true. So I like including that one. It's a pretty good one. So let's see, this is our wilderness checklist. So if you want wilderness, these are the things that you need to have. So 5,000 acres is a typical unit of wilderness. That is just a guideline. The smallest wilderness area is, I think it's 4 acres, but it's a pelican. You probably know this. It's called Pelican Island. It's in Florida, and they knew they had to save that for the pelicans. So they have this 4-acre wilderness. I believe it's 4 acres. But typically they're looking for 5,000 or more. Roadless, which means no constructed roads or maintained, regularly used. I call them ways. They're called ways because we don't want to call them a road, because we don't want them to be thought of as a road. It's a way. It's a way to get somewhere. That's all. We don't want to call it a road because that could get misconstrued, and people want to keep it there because we have to have our roads. And that's a whole other thing in Utah. So they're usually natural, which has appeared to be affected primarily by the forces of nature. They need educational and scientific value and historical cultural value. So that's what you're looking for in wilderness. So we made a little chart, kind of like when you go to a cell phone store, and what does that company provide and what does that company provide? Well, a monument will allow all those things on the far left. A national park will allow some of them, but not all of them. And a wilderness doesn't allow any of those things. That would lose the wilderness. So that's kind of the key. The key is that wilderness doesn't allow any of those things. So it leaves it natural, leaves it the way it was. And why is wilderness important? I mean, just for, it's a great place to go when you get your time off, but it's a massive carbon sink, so carbon sequestration. So it keeps carbon in the ground where it should be instead of releasing it into the atmosphere. It's critical habitat. It protects those riparian zones and biological soil crust, which is a whole nother presentation. I won't bore you with that. Some of you may know what it is, but it's kind of like the coral of the desert, if you will. So the key takeaways is wilderness designation is the highest protection Congress can give, and wilderness designation is use it or lose it. So basically, if you don't protect the wilderness, it's going to be gone forever. So once it's messed up, it takes a long, long, long time to come back. So that's why we want to try to protect these areas in Utah ASAP. All right, the Gunnison sage grouse. It's a subspecies of the greater sage grouse. I think it's more northern Utah and southern Colorado is their range. If you all know about sage grouse, they're pretty cool. They all kind of live around this one central area in their territory, and then when it comes to mating season, they all come together in this area called a lek, L-E-K, and they do these cool dances, and they have these puffy chests that come out to attract the mate. And when you plow that over and make a parking lot, yeah, you kind of lose those territories. Let's see. So they're in Bears Ears, Indian Creek, which I believe is by the San Rafael Swell, and Cedar Mesa, which is adjacent to Bears Ears. Less than 5,000 individuals remain in Utah and Colorado. So yeah, they're endangered. They've lost about 90% of its former range. So once again, we can protect some of these areas and reduce that habitat loss, which is the running theme for the most part here. We can help save these birds. So origins of the Utah wilderness movement. So this goes back to public lands and how they're being used and attitudes out west. So the FLPMA, the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act of 1976. Basically, once again, activists and people concerned about the environment said, you're using up all the forest, you're cutting down all the trees. So they enacted FLPMA, Federal Land and Policy Management Act, to where we want to use BLM lands, Bureau of Land Management, for multiple uses as it has been. They added in sustained yield, which is you can use the forest, you can log, but you can't cut it all down. You need to save some and kind of, be a little bit more managed and have some rhyme to the reason and not just clear cut and leave it all to waste. So this required the Bureau of Land Management to inventory public lands in the 80s. So it required the Bureau of Land Management in each state to go out and walk the land and say and tell and kind of report back on what they had. So that's the inventory. Like, what's our wilderness? How much wilderness do we have? So out of 23 million acres of BLM land in Utah, the BLM only identified 2.5 million acres. So the problem therein lies with in that period of time, there was probably only 500,000 people in Utah. So you're out in these very rural and remote towns, and there's not a ton of people. Most of them are ranchers and miners and, living off the natural resources of the land. But then maybe one of the guys there worked for the BLM because it's a job and why not? So he might be the cousin of the logger or the grazer or the miner. So when they're going out and doing these inventories, they're like, no, it looks like it could be wilderness, but we're not going to include scientific value or educational value or natural, we're going to take that out. So it's not going to qualify as wilderness. But people kind of got wind of it. SUWA got involved. SUWA got formed because of this, because they knew what they were finding. And these inventories were skewed and not accurate. So that's kind of what formed SUWA. And I know. So the inventories were corrupt and they were biased. There was some movement to fix them, but then the Reagan administration started and everybody got fired. So there wasn't a whole lot of movement. So SUWA formed by some activists. So basically people like us, concerned citizens, and some Sierra Club folks and some former BLM folks. And they actually went out and did their own survey, and wrote a book. And the book is called Wilderness on the Edge. And the BLM actually uses Wilderness on the Edge to this day to base their findings. So we've went from not getting along with the BLM very well to like we've been helping them for the last, I don't know, 10 years with doing work that they need to get done. So we have these stewardship projects, and they've actually called us a partner not too long ago. I don't know what's going to happen after the 20th of January, but in the last 4 years, they've been calling us partners, which is kind of cool. So SUWA came up with America's Red Rock Wilderness Act,
Venues
which
at
is a bill before Congress. And so that really makes it a national issue. And that's what
Terry's
I'm talking
Restaurant,
with y'all.
Charlevoix, Michigan menu.
So yeah, so Utah kind of is ground zero for public land battles. And there's all kinds of crazy stuff. I'm not going to have a ton of time to talk about it, but so
Terry's menu, Charlevoix Restaurant.
Utah public lands. I think somebody might need to mute their phone if you don't mind. Let's see. So Utah public lands pre 1995. We got national parks and monuments and BLM wilderness study areas, which are some of these areas from the inventory. The wilderness study areas are what the inventory produced. They were basically set aside and protected, but not federally protected as wilderness. They're study areas, so nothing's going to happen to them until Congress decides what to do with them. And then this is kind of today after we introduced ARWA. And so there's been some national monuments and recreation areas designated since we've started. So that you can see definitely the difference in those two. Those are not all protected. Some of these are proposed, so don't let it fool you. And then we have important bird areas designated by the Audubon Society in Utah. So there's 22 important bird areas in Utah. 7 of them are seven are global important bird areas. One of them being Zion National Park. Once again, I'm focusing on the areas we're trying to get protected. So Zion is one of the global IBAs that we're trying to get protected. State IBAs, there are 15 in Utah, and one of them is in Bears Ears, the Escalante River, and Red Cliffs National Conservation Area. So yeah, so if you go, like, okay, get ready for this. All right. So here's ARWA lands, America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, ARWA, and your IBAs. I'm just going to toggle back and forth, and you can see they overlap almost perfectly. If anything, there's more ARWA lands than IBAs, but I like this visual. So if we were to protect ARWA lands, we'd be protecting those IBAs forever. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's just a cool visual. I did that myself, and I turned it into the GIS folks at SUWA, and they just laughed at me, but I thought it was cool. All right, Pinyon Jays. I love Pinyon Jays. I really do, because they're always out in the middle of nowhere where I'm at, and they're very squawky, and they usually come in flocks. And I didn't know how super cool they were until I did my first Audubon presentation. Earlier last year. But yeah, I always wondered what those guys were, and now I know, and they're super cool. First, the last time I was out in Utah was in the fall, and all the pinyon pines back then were just wide open, and you could literally shake a pine cone and the pinion nuts would fall out. So that's what the Pinyon Jays are after. And they're, I guess, doing this research, I found out that they kind of plant them all around and come back and get them later, but they forget some of them. Apparently, they have a really good memory, and they get a lot of them, but they don't get all of them, and that's what creates the Pinyon-Juniper woodland. So, once again, Pinyon-Juniper woodland removal is what's going on with them, and they're kind of a keystone species. So if we lose the Pinyon Jay, we're going to lose the Pinyon juniper forests, and Utah is kind of hell bent on getting rid of them. And this is what happens. Let's see. See if this video. That is what they call vegetation treatment. We call it chaining, because they basically take a giant ship anchor chain between two bulldozers and just clear down everything that is in between them, as you just saw. And they do that for fire prevention, and they think the forest is getting too overgrown, so it has to be controlled. So yeah, that's some of the things that Utah does. And then they'll seed those areas. They put seeds out, and they're non-native seeds, so they're invasive. And then once it starts growing, then they bring in cows. So I'm not really sure what the purpose of doing that is. Is it really for, fire control and keeping the forest from overgrowing, or for cattle raising? Anyway, I'll get off my soapbox. But so back to America's Red Rock Wilderness Act, or ARWA. I'll just try to skip over and give you the important stuff. Yeah, it started out with 5.7 million acres. Utah comes back and said, we'll give you 1.8, and you better take this. It's the best you'll ever get. But we weren't, even the Wayne Owens in Utah, he was a Democrat in Utah, believe it or not. He was like, no, this isn't going to happen. We're going to fight for it. And so they got 5.7 acres designated. A little bit of history on the Utah delegation. They're not for it. Like, the Utah government would rather go out there and use these areas for all the money that they could make off them, and forget about wilderness. They don't care about wilderness. So Utah filed an original jurisdiction lawsuit seeking the transfer of 18+ million acres of public land to the state for private control. So they wanted 18+ million acres to do what they wanted with. They wanted to take it away from you. It's public land. It's our land. Wanted to take it out of the federal government's hands, run it themselves, which basically would have just been developing it and mining it and all that stuff. So, boy, was it yesterday? Monday. Yeah, it was Monday. The Supreme Court rejected that suit. They said, you guys don't have a leg to stand on. Yeah, you got to go through the proper channels, because they didn't even go through the proper channels. They just gave it right to the Supreme Court instead of going through all the district courts to work their way up to the Supreme Court. So that was a big win yesterday. This is an article that came out. Utah's even Republicans disagree. I can't read it. I'm sorry. Disagree with state leaders about the state's national monuments. So around 75% have strong support for monuments, and it's around 75%. So it was something like 71% is for Grand Staircase and 74% is for Bears Ears Monument. which if you're not sure about, those were monuments that during the last Trump administration were cut in half. And we're pretty sure it's probably going to happen again, but hopefully it'll just be temporary like it was last time. 89% of Utahns are for a tribal role in the management of these areas. Public versus leaders, meaning 84% of Utahns are for protection of these lands, whereas the Utah delegation would rather, see it get used to make them some money. But yeah, so that was today. So January 14th at 10 a.m. that came out. There's just been so much stuff going on in Utah. But there's just been stuff going on almost every day lately. Let me see what I'm doing here. Ba-ba-ba. All right. And then, yeah, so yes, it worked. All right, so here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna flip forward because I'm running out of time. So this was my old slide. It's not the 118th Congress anymore, but so America's Red Rock Wilderness Act will aim to protect over 8.4 million acres of public land as wilderness. So that's what we're trying to get done.